Here are two quarterbacks. One is in the Hall of Fame, one is not. Who do you think is? Well, if you guessed this guy, you're right, he's in the Hall of Fame. If you guessed him, you're wrong, he's not. That's Terry Bradshaw, and that's Ken Anderson. Let me tell you folks, it is a federal crime that Ken Anderson is not in the Hall of Fame, and you can't convince me otherwise.
Heck, I just want Kenny Anderson's name to appear on the final 25 or 15. Ken Anderson can't get in that room. There's like a barricade on that door.
Now, I'm not saying Anderson is better than Bradshaw, that's not really the point. My point is that, any way you slice it, there is a strong case for Kenny Anderson to be in the Hall of Fame. Anderson was first eligible for the Hall in 1991. That means he's been snubbed a grand total of 33 times. But why does he belong in the Hall of Fame? Well, let me break that down. From the start, his career was fairly unique. He wasn't a top recruit going into college. He had to write a letter to the football coach at Augustana College asking for a tryout. He'd get a spot on the roster and go on to break every passing record. Now, it was a Division III college, but it was enough for him to get drafted in 1971 in the 3rd round by the Bengals. And he's one of only 2 players to ever make it from that college to the NFL. He'd become the starting quarterback for the Bengals in 1972, and the rest was history.
One of the most accurate arms and an uncanny mind to pick up blitzes. He was impossible for us to blitz. He'll go down as one of the greatest quarterbacks that ever played.
From 1973 to 1977, Ken Anderson was one of the best quarterbacks in the league. Yet when I look back on it, it seems that Ken Anderson was even underappreciated during his time. If you watched him play, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts and what the perception of Anderson was outside of Cincinnati. I say that I think he's underappreciated because there are several more seasons you could argue Anderson deserved the MVP, but he only won it once. Take 1974, when he threw for 18 touchdowns and 10 interceptions. He led the league in completion percentage, yards, and yards per game. I mean, forget MVP for a second. He didn't even get selected to the Pro Bowl. In 1975, he threw for 21 touchdowns, 11 interceptions, led the league in yards per attempt, passer rating, passing yards, and led the Bengals to a 10-3 record. I don't want to say he should have won MVP either of these years, because Ken Stabler, who won in 1974, and Frank Tarkenton, who won in 1975, had strong cases. But here are their numbers against Anderson. To be fair, in 1974 the Bengals did not have a strong season, they went 7-7, but in 1975 they went 11-3 and made it to the divisional round. Then in 1982, he was bested by a kicker. This year you could make a case for Dan Fouts, but Anderson led in passer rating, and his 70.6% completion percentage was then the single season record, which stood for almost 3 decades until Drew Brees broke it. The Bengals finished 7-2 in the strike-shortened season, which was 3rd best behind the 8-1 Redskins and Raiders. Following Hall of Fame level of play from 1973 to 1976, he hit a mid-career slump. I don't know if voters are holding this against him, but let's give this some context. Firstly, he broke his hand in 1978, and rushed back after 4 games. But it did not help. He struggled, and he probably should have taken more time to recover. Then in 1979 he had some more injuries, he hurt his back, and he was not helped by how useless the O-line was during this stretch. In 1979 he was sacked a league high 46 times. The defense was inconsistent for most of his career, and in 1979 they had the worst defense in the league in yards and points. Despite the struggles, consider this. In 1977, the average passer rating was 60.7, Anderson's was 69.7. I don't want to cherry pick stats, but I bring this up to say, even in a down year, he was no scrub. Anderson would have his own career resurgence in 1981. He earned League MVP, Offensive Player of the Year, and Comeback Player of the Year, threw for 29 touchdowns to just 10 interceptions, which was the lowest interception percentage at 2.1, and his 98.4 passer rating was 8 points higher than Dan Fouts, who was number 2, at 90.6. That year, he'd continue his dominance into the playoffs. He'd defeat the Chargers in the infamous Freezer Bowl, which featured wind chills of negative 59 degrees Fahrenheit, in the Bengals' first playoff win in franchise history. In the Super Bowl, he threw for 300 yards, 2 touchdowns, rushed for 1, but also did throw 2 interceptions. However, he almost led the Bengals from a 20-point deficit in the second half, ultimately coming up short 26-21. It's also worth noting he was pretty underrated as a runner. He finished with over 2,000 career rushing yards and 20 touchdowns, and as I mentioned, he had one in the Super Bowl. Then, from 1983 to retirement in 1986, performance began to decline. He suffered a neck injury against the Steelers, and while he only missed 3 weeks, his performance would slowly decline up until retirement. But to slump in your final few years is acceptable. Okay, so that's his career dominance, but let me add this to the mix, and I think it makes his case unique. He excelled in 2 different eras, the dead ball era and the live ball era. When Ken Anderson entered the league in 1971, it was a miserable time for passing. The average quarterback finished with 156 yards per game, 15 touchdowns, 21 interceptions, and completed just 51% of their throws. Passing was an afterthought. and Anderson entered before a seismic shift in the league, one which would eventually see the passing game explode. By 1981, the average yards per game was already over 200. As a comparison for how he was performing in the dead ball era, from 1971 to 1977, this is his touchdown to interception ratio compared against Dan Fouts. Fouts threw for 34 touchdowns and 57 interceptions. Anderson threw for 99 touchdowns and only 69 interceptions. He was posting live ball era stats in the dead ball era. He had back-to-back passing titles in 1974 and 1975, and then finished 5th in 1981 and 3rd in 1982. Two different decades and two different eras of football.
He may have been the most accurate passer in NFL history.
Now, you can't talk about Ken Anderson without mentioning Bill Walsh. While being a beneficiary of the first installment of the infamous West Coast offense before it was popularized in San Francisco, Anderson did execute it perfectly. He replaced Virgil Carter, who the system was originally designed around, and generated better results. His first season as a starter, the Bengals went 8-6, followed by a 10-4 season and playoff appearance in 1973. The West Coast offense did lend itself to a higher completion percentage, passer rating, and touchdown to interception ratios, and that is also evident by Steve Young and Joe Montana stats, who both retired with the highest passer rating in NFL history. So I can't see how the West Coast offense is a valid knock on Anderson. Also, Bill Walsh left in 1975, and Anderson would make it to the Super Bowl and face Walsh in 1981. He also had to deal with multiple head coaches, 5 during his career, and still thrived. So please don't tell me this guy's a system quarterback. The system changed several times.
You think of all the Hall of Fame quarterbacks, Bradshaw, Montana, with Walsh, Bob Greasy, all of that stayed the same. They had the same head coaches. So they kept refining their system. Anderson adjusted to a completely different system and still succeeded.
I've also seen some takes that he was a dink and dunk artist. Well, Isaac Curtis would like a word, as he was hauling in deep bombs from 1973 to 1976 for an average of 19.9 yards a reception. During that stretch, Curtis ranked second in receiving yards and touchdowns. Anderson also led the league in yards per attempt in 1974 and 1975, refuting this claim. So it's also worth comparing Anderson to the quarterbacks that are in the Hall of Fame. And when you compare the stats, well, Anderson looks pretty good. From 1973 to 1976, the only quarterbacks to win more were Frank Tarkenton, Ken Stabler, and Roger Staubach. Only Tarkenton had more passing yards, and only Stabler had more touchdowns. And this is where the rest of his stats sit, compared to all of the other Hall of Fame quarterbacks. You can see he's kind of middle of the pack, slightly better for most of it. I also wanted to note that while Anderson did have some Pro Bowl talent, Bob Trumpy, Isaac Curtis, Charlie Joyner, Chris Collinsworth, and obviously Hall of Famer Anthony Munoz, Anderson lacked the help that many of these Hall of Fame quarterbacks had. He had Terry Bradshaw with the Steel Curtain defense, Frank Tarkenton had the Purple People Eaters. Now that's not to diminish the quality of these players, they were great, but the talent was definitely not on the same level. Anderson was also playing in a run-first era and didn't have a star running back to rely on for most of his career. It wasn't until 1981 where he'd have a running back rush for more than 1,000 yards. And again, the defense was all over the place. Some years they were okay, some years they were pretty bad. So overall, I hope I made a strong case for Kenny to be in the Hall, but let me know your thoughts down below. Should he be in the Hall of Fame, or was I way off?